The sputtering tallow candle cast long, dancing shadows across Sir Francis Walsingham's chambers in Whitehall Palace. Outside, the humid air of late July 1588 hung thick and still, mirroring the tense anticipation gripping London. Maps lay strewn across the heavy oak table, England's coastline, the choppy waters of the Channel, the ports of Flanders. Walsingham, his face etched with weariness but his eyes sharp, traced a finger along the coast near Dunkirk. Everything depended on the sea beggars, on Justinus of Nassau holding the Flemish ports shut, bottling up the Duke of Parma's veteran army. Without Parma's troops, the great Spanish Armada, currently battling headwinds in the Bay of Biscay, was merely a fleet. Fearsome, yes, but unable to land the decisive blow. A rap at the door broke the silence. Walsingham looked up, his brow furrowed. Enter. His secretary, Thomas Phelps, slipped in, holding a sealed dispatch. Phelps, master of cipher, looked paler than usual. From Ostend, Sir Francis, marked urgent. Walsingham took the small scroll, his practiced fingers breaking the wax seal. The message was short, written in the familiar cipher used by his agent embedded with the Dutch forces. He nodded curtly to Phelps, who immediately fetched the cipher key from a locked chest. Together they bent over the message, the only sound the scratching of Phelps' quill as he decoded symbol by symbol. Spanish sortie. Nieuport dawn tide, Phelps murmured, deciphering. Walsingham's posture stiffened. He remained utterly still, watching the words emerge onto the parchment. Overwhelmed blockading squadron, Justinus's ships scattered, significant losses. A cold dread, unfamiliar and unwelcome, began to seep into Walsingham's veins. He waved Phelps to continue, his own hand unconsciously clenching into a fist atop the map of Flanders. Parma's barges, assembling, Graveline's estuary. Embarking troops reported. Phelps looked up, his eyes wide with the terrifying implication. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The nightmare scenario, the linchpin of England's strategy against the Armada, had failed. Parma was not contained. Walsingham straightened slowly, the decoded message trembling slightly in his hand. For weeks, reports had detailed Parma's meticulous preparations. Thousands of invasion barges, flat-bottomed and vulnerable, waiting only for the Armada to secure the Channel crossing and clear away the persistent Dutch flyboats that preyed on any vessel attempting to leave the shallow coastal ports. Those flyboats were England's crucial first line of defense, the cork in Parma's bottle. And now the cork was out. How? Walsingham's voice was low, dangerous. Justinus had explicit orders, sufficient ships. The message mentions a sudden, favorable wind coinciding with the tide, Sir Francis, Phelps offered hesitantly, and a larger force of Spanish pinnaces and armed vessels than anticipated pushing out from Nieuport. They broke the line. Walsingham paced the room, his mind racing. The carefully constructed defense plan crumbled before his eyes. Lord Howard's fleet, even reinforced by Drake's Western Squadron, was tasked with engaging the Armada itself, preventing it from establishing naval supremacy. They couldn't simultaneously fight the Spanish galleons and blockade the Flemish coast miles away. They had relied utterly on the Dutch. This changed everything. The Armada no longer needed to decisively defeat Howard's fleet or find a secure deep-water anchorage. It merely needed to arrive in the Straits of Dover, form a protective screen between Calais and the English coast, and hold the English navy at bay for perhaps 12, maybe 24 hours. Just long enough for Parma's hardened veterans, the finest infantry in Europe, to make the short crossing in their barges and land on the beaches of Kent. Once ashore, England's hastily assembled militia, however brave, would stand little chance against the tercios. His teeth, Walsingham breathed, stopping before the map again. His finger jabbed at the narrow stretch of water between Calais and Dover. Medina Sidonia needs only occupy this strait. He doesn't need victory at sea, merely presence. He looked sharply at Phelps. Has this news reached the fleet? Unlikely, Sir Francis. The messenger vessel barely evaded capture itself. This may be the first reliable report to reach England. Then it falls to us. Walsingham strode towards the door. Ready my swiftest horse. I must inform Her Majesty and Lord Howard immediately. Send duplicate messages via the postriders to Plymouth and Dover. Mark them with the triple cross for utmost urgency. Lord Howard must know that Parma's army is unchained. He paused, his hand on the door latch, a grim cast to his features. Pray God our ships are swift enough, Phelps. Pray that Howard can somehow prevent the rendezvous. For if Parma's army joins hands with the Armada in the Straits... He didn't finish the thought, the potential consequences too horrifying to voice. The fate of England, the Queen, and the Protestant faith now hung by the most slender of threads, frayed by a sudden Spanish sortie on a Flemish dawn tide. The sea breeze that reached London felt less like a promise of relief and more like the chilling whisper of doom. The invasion was no longer a possibility to be thwarted at sea. It was becoming a terrifying reality, poised to cross the narrow waters. The beacons on the southern coast, prepared for warning, might soon signal not just the Armada's approach, but the arrival of conquest itself. The frantic clatter of hooves echoed through the narrow London streets as Walsingham, heedless of startled pedestrians scattering before him, urged his mount onward. He bypassed Whitehall, heading directly for Richmond where the Queen held court, seeking refuge from the city's summer heat and plague fears. Every shadow seemed a potential Spanish agent, every delay a potential death knell for England. Behind him, Phillips had already dispatched the fastest postriders, their leather satchels bearing copies of the dire news, marked for Howard wherever the fleet might be found off the coast. Yet Walsingham knew the fragility of such messages: a lame horse, a washed-out bridge, an ambush on a lonely road, any could sever the vital link. He carried the primary burden, the direct warning. The horse strained beneath him, its breath coming in ragged gasps that mirrored his own tightly wound anxiety. He had spent years building webs of spies, anticipating threats, countering plots, but this was a blunt instrument of conquest aimed directly at the kingdom's heart, and his intricate network had failed to prevent the Dutch shield from shattering. The weight of that failure pressed down harder than the humid summer air. Aboard the Ark Royal, somewhere off the Isle of Wight, the wind had frustratingly died down, leaving the great warships lolling on a gentle swell under a hazy sun. Lord Howard of Effingham stood on the high poop deck, scanning the horizon eastward. Beside him, Sir Francis Drake paced restlessly, his usual swagger muted by the inactivity and the growing unease. Days had passed since the last confirmed sighting of the Armada, moving ponderously up the channel. They had harried its flanks, tested its formations with cannon fire, but inflicted no decisive blow. Now silence. This waiting gnaws my Lord Admiral, Drake muttered, slapping a gauntlet against his thigh. They cannot have simply vanished. Medina Sidonia holds eastward, surely, towards Parma. Howard nodded grimly. Aye, towards Parma, but where and doing what? The lack of word is unsettling. A lookout hailed from the masthead. Sail ho, small vessel making hard towards us. Flying the pennant of Dover, a collective tension gripped the officers on deck. A fast pinnace, oars flashing rhythmically to supplement its meager sail, was closing the distance. Minutes stretched into an eternity before a boat was lowered from the Ark Royal to meet the incoming messenger. Howard watched, his knuckles white on the railing as the boat returned, a salt-stained, exhausted figure scrambling aboard. The man, gasping for breath, clutched a sealed packet. From Sir Francis Walsingham, my Lord Admiral. Marked utmost urgency, Howard snatched the packet, broke the seal with trembling fingers, and scanned the contents. His face paled. He looked up, his eyes meeting Drake's questioning gaze. God help us, Howard whispered, his voice barely audible above the creak of timbers. The Dutch blockade, it's broken. Parma is free. Drake swore violently, a string of seafaring oaths. Then there is no time for caution. We must strike them now, smash into the Armada before they can shield the crossing. Howard shook his head, crumpling the message in his fist. They need only presence, Drake, presence in the straits. A direct assault on their crescent formation could cripple us, leave the crossing completely unopposed. We must intercept, yes, but intelligently. We must prevent the rendezvous above all else. The old tension between the cautious Lord Admiral and the aggressive privateer flared instantly, now sharpened by the terrifying clarity of their predicament. Near Dunkirk, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Alessandro Farnese, Duke of Parma, stood on a hastily constructed wooden pier, his sharp eyes missing nothing. Thousands of his veteran soldiers, Spanish, Italian, Walloon, German mercenaries, were filing onto the vast flotilla of shallow-draft barges and requisitioned coastal vessels crammed into the harbour and along the nearby canals. The breakout past the Dutch patrol ships, achieved through a daring night sortie coordinated with a high spring tide, had been a masterstroke of timing and audacity. But now came the Herculean logistical task. Loading tens of thousands of men, their equipment, thousands of horses, artillery and supplies onto vessels never designed for open sea, even a short crossing, was fraught with peril. Priests moved among the ranks, offering blessings and hearing hurried confessions. Sergeants bellowed orders, maintaining discipline amidst the jostling crowds. Parma ignored the stench of sweat, tar and bilge water. He felt a surge of grim satisfaction. Years of painstaking campaigning in the Low Countries, the sieges, the diplomacy, the brutal suppression of rebellion, it had all led to this moment. A messenger arrived, breathless. Your Highness, a signal from the Duke of Medina Sidonia's flagship. He is approaching Calais roads and expects your forces to be ready to embark at dawn. Parma nodded curtly. Inform the Duke we are embarking. Dawn will see us ready. He glanced towards the grey waters of the channel, a flicker of impatience crossing his usually impassive face. The sea was calm, the wind like perfect conditions, but he knew how quickly the weather could turn. Everything depended on the Armada holding the English fleet at bay, just long enough. He turned back to the teeming docks. Faster, he commanded his officers. Leave nothing non-essential. Every man, every horse ready by first light. England awaits. In Richmond Palace, the news struck Queen Elizabeth like a physical blow. Walsingham, travel-stained and gaunt, delivered the report in low, urgent tones in her private chambers. The colour drained from her face, leaving her painted cheeks stark against her pallor. For a moment she seemed frail, the weight of her crown and the imminent threat almost overwhelming. Then her spine visibly stiffened. She rose from her chair, her eyes, usually so adept at masking her thoughts, blazing with a mixture of fear and fury. Parma unleashed, she repeated softly, testing the words. And Howard must stop him in the straits. She paced the room, her long fingers twisting a ring. Counselors like Burgley might counsel caution, even negotiation from a position of weakness, but she knew that was impossible now. Parma's tercios landing on English soil meant the end of her reign, the end of her church, the end of England as she knew it. Walsingham, she said, her voice regaining its customary authority, ensure Lord Hunsdon has the London-trained bands ready to march to Tilbury at an hour's notice. Send word to every Lord Lieutenant, muster the militia, arm every able-bodied man. We fight on the beaches, we fight in the fields, we fight in the streets. She paused before a window looking out over the Thames. And God, she added, her voice dropping again, laced with a desperate prayer, God grant Lord Howard the wisdom and the fortune he needs. Grant Drake the restraint and Frobisher the courage, for all our sakes. The fate of her kingdom rested now not just on wooden ships and iron cannon, but on the capricious winds and the resolve of men facing impossible odds in the narrow sea. The waiting, she knew, would be the hardest part. The air crackled with tension aboard the Ark Royal. Lord Howard scanned the horizon towards Calais, his knuckles white on the rail. Smoke still drifted from the fireship attacked the previous night, a desperate gamble that had caused chaos but hadn't broken the Armada's crescent formation entirely. Medina Sidonia, despite his lack of sea command experience, had held his nerve, cutting anchors and drifting, but reforming further east. Now through the haze Howard could see them. Parma's barges, a swarm of low, vulnerable craft, emerging from Nieuport and Dunkirk, hugging the coast under the protective flank of the Armada's galleases. Drake, aboard the Revenge, was signalling furiously, advocating a pell-mell attack on the barges. Howard hesitated. His own ammunition was perilously low after the engagement off Gravelines, and the wind, though favourable for the English, was pushing the Armada inexorably towards the sandbanks of Zealand if they stayed put. But they weren't staying put, they were shielding Parma. Signal the fleet, Howard commanded, his voice tight. Engage the galleases, we must try to break through to the barges. God help us, we must. The first broadsides roared, but the Spanish return fire, though less rapid, was heavy. The sheer mass of the Armada ships provided a formidable barrier, and the powerful oar-driven galleases maneuvered threateningly in the shallower water, their heavy cannons spitting fire at any English ship that dared close range with the vulnerable transports. Aboard one of the lead barges, Alessandro Farnese, Duke of Parma, stood near the prow, wrapped in a heavy cloak against the chill sea spray. He ignored the distant thunder of cannons to his seaward side. That was Medina Sidonia's concern now. His gaze was fixed solely on the pale cliffs rising ahead. Was that Dover, or perhaps Folkestone? It mattered little, it was England. Years of meticulous planning, months of frustrating delays, days of agonizing waiting, all culminated in this moment. His veterans, the hardened tercios, were packed shoulder to shoulder on the flat-bottomed vessels, their armor gleaming dully, their faces grimly expectant. Horses shifted nervously, their hooves thudding dully on the wooden decks. He could feel the vulnerability, the terrifying exposure of his army afloat on these clumsy vessels. If Howard broke through, he banished the thought. Medina Sidonia would hold. He had to. A fleet had been sacrificed for this moment. He raised a spyglass, focusing on the shoreline. He could make out figures moving, tiny specks against the green hills. Militia, peasants with pikes. They would be no match for his battle-hardened Spaniards and Walloons. The real fight would be for London. He lowered the glass, a grim satisfaction settling over him. The invasion had begun. In Kent, near the village of Walmer, Thomas Baker hefted his pitchfork, its tines sharpened but still pitifully inadequate. Around him, men shuffled nervously, farmers, blacksmiths, weavers, clad in boiled leather jacks or simple doublets, armed with bows, ancient bills, or whatever came to hand. Sir Thomas Scott, the local commander, rode amongst them, offering words of encouragement that sounded thin against the vastness of the sea and the approaching threat. They had heard the guns booming out in the channel for hours, a terrifying, rolling thunder that had now mostly faded, replaced by an even more dreadful sight: sails, hundreds of them. Not just the towering warships of the Armada, now visible as a dark line further out, but closer, much closer, a mass of lower vessels stretching along the coast, heading for the flatter beaches around Deal. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped Thomas's gut. He glanced at his neighbour Will, whose face was ashen. "They're coming then," Will muttered, his voice trembling. "God have mercy on us." The beacon fires had been lit hours ago, sending plumes of smoke inland, but what help could arrive in time? These weren't raiders, this was an army, vast and purposeful, sailing directly for their shores under the shield of the greatest fleet ever assembled. Thomas tightened his grip on the pitchfork. He thought of his wife, his daughter, hiding in the woods inland. He thought of the stories of Spanish cruelty in the Low Countries. Fear warred with a desperate, nascent anger. This was his home. They would not take it easily. News reached Richmond Palace in chaotic fragments. A messenger arrived, breathless, reporting Howard engaged with the Armada off Gravelines, the outcome uncertain. Another spoke of Parma's barges sighted leaving port. Then silence. Elizabeth paced her chambers, Leicester hovering anxiously nearby, Burgley pale and grim-faced by the door. The waiting was torture. Every gust of wind seemed to carry the sound of cannon. Every shout in the courtyard below felt like the arrival of disastrous news. Why no word from Howard? She demanded, rounding on Walsingham, who looked utterly drained. Have his ships been sunk? Has he been forced to disengage? Walsingham could only shake his head. Majesty, the latest rider saw Palmer's fleet proceeding towards Kent, shielded by the Armada. Howard was attempting to intercept, but the Spanish formation was holding. Elizabeth stopped, her hand flying to her throat. Shielded, proceeding, the implications crashed down upon her. Howard hadn't stopped them, the sea had failed her. Palmer was crossing, perhaps already landing. Leicester stepped forward. Majesty, you must withdraw inland, to Windsor or further. London cannot be held if Palmer lands in strength. Elizabeth looked at him, her eyes filled with a terrifying mixture of fury and despair. Withdraw, while Spanish boots march on English soil, while my people face their steel. Her voice rose. Never. I ordered them to fight on the beaches, in the fields. Am I to flee while they obey? She strode towards the maps spread across a large table. Where is Huntston? Where are the trained bands? Burghley spoke, his voice heavy. Marching towards Tilbury, Majesty, but Palmer's veterans, our militia. He didn't need to finish. The disparity was horrifyingly clear. Elizabeth stared at the map of Kent, her finger tracing the coastline near Deal. Her kingdom, her church, her life, all balanced on the courage of farmers with pitchforks and the dwindling powder in Howard's guns. The waiting was over. The nightmare had begun. The air in Richmond thickened, heavy with unspoken fears. Walsingham, his face etched with exhaustion, spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. Majesty, the reports are consistent. Palmer landed near Deal and Sandwich. Thousands strong, veterans, they brushed aside the Kentish militia. He paused, swallowing hard. Casualties among our men were severe. Leicester moved closer to Elizabeth, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his sword, a useless gesture against an enemy miles away. Anne Boleyn's daughter does not run, Elizabeth stated, her voice dangerously quiet, yet it cut through the room's tension like steel. She stands here with London, with England. She turned to Burghley, her gaze intense. My Lord Treasurer, what is the state of the city's defences? The Tower. Burghley wrung his hands, his usual composure shattered. Majesty, the Tower guns command the river, yes, but the city walls. They are old, neglected. The trained bands are mustering, but against Palmer's tercios. He trailed off, the comparison stark. We have perhaps 15,000 men of varying quality converging on London, including Hunston's force. Palmer likely landed with more and battle-hardened. Then we make every street a fortress, every house a bastion. Elizabeth declared, striking the map again, this time pointing towards London itself. Send word to Huntston, he is to march directly to London, secure the northern approaches. Lord Mayor, fortify Ludgate and Newgate, arm the citizenry, every man capable of holding a pike or a billhook. Walsingham interjected, Majesty, arming the citizenry indiscriminately. There are many papists in London. Desperate men might see Palmer as a liberator. And would you have us disarm loyal Englishmen for fear of shadows? Elizabeth shot back, her eyes flashing. Palmer brings the Inquisition, Walsingham, not liberation. Even the most fervent Catholic amongst my subjects knows the pyres that await them under Spanish rule. Trust in their English hearts, Sir Francis, if not their doctrine. Now go, see it done. As the councillors dispersed, galvanized by her certainty yet chilled by the grim reality, Elizabeth allowed herself a moment's stillness. She walked to the tall windows overlooking the Thames, the grey water mirroring the sky. The sea had betrayed her. Drake Howard, valiant, yes, but unable to prevent the unthinkable. She thought of the faces in the crowds during her progresses, the cheers, the adoration. Had she led them to this, to slaughter? The weight of her crown, usually a source of strength, felt like lead. Leicester approached quietly. Elizabeth, he murmured, using her name, a privilege few dared. There is still time. A retreat to the Midlands, rally forces. She turned, her expression softening momentarily before hardening again. Robert, if I flee, England's spirit breaks. A queen in hiding cannot inspire men to die for her. I will share London's fate. God's will be done. Miles away, on the shingle beaches of Kent, Thomas stumbled through the bloody chaos. The militia's brief, panicked resistance had dissolved into a rout. He had seen men he'd known his whole life cut down by disciplined Spanish volleys, or impaled on the long pikes of the advancing tercios. The air stank of gunpowder, salt, and iron. He'd lost his pitchfork in the panicked scramble, tripping over the corpse of young Will, the baker's son. Now unarmed, heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird, he scrambled inland through the marshy ground, Spanish shouts echoing behind him. He saw the smoke rising from Deal, not bonfires of celebration, but the flames consuming English homes. He had to reach Mary and Little Bess. He had to warn others further inland. This wasn't a raid, it was conquest. Near the rapidly expanding Spanish beachhead, the Duke of Parma watched his veterans efficiently secure the landing zone. Columns of troops were already marching inland, fanning out to secure the roads. Despite the smooth execution, a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. The English fleet, though unable to stop his crossing, was still out there, harassing the Armada. The winds were fickle. His supply lines across the Channel were vulnerable. He needed London quickly. He needed Elizabeth, captured or dead, to break English resistance before winter or before the French or the Dutch saw an opportunity in England's agony. An aide approached, saluting sharply. "Your Excellency, cavalry scouts report minimal resistance on the road towards Canterbury." Local militia seems scattered. "We have captured several local officials." "Good," Palmer nodded curtly. "Consolidate our position. Send word to Medina Sidonia we have landed, but the Armada must maintain the shield. We push for London within 3 days." He looked towards the northwest, towards the unseen prize. Capturing the heretic queen would be the ultimate victory, shattering the Protestant rebellion across Europe. Back in London, panic began its insidious creep. Rumors flew faster than messengers. The Spanish were burning villages wholesale, Howard's fleet was sunk, the Queen was fleeing. Prices for horses and carts soared as wealthier merchants began quietly packing their valuables. The trained bands mustered in Smithfield and Mile End, a colourful but uneven assembly of apprentices, shopkeepers, and agging soldiers, their determination mixed with palpable fear. Pikes were distributed, old arquebuses cleaned. Barricades started appearing across major thoroughfares, constructed from overturned wagons, furniture, and paving stones. The defiant roar Elizabeth demanded was beginning, but it was laced with the tremor of desperation. At the tower, the yeoman warders checked powder stores, their grim faces reflecting the gravity of the hour. The Thames watermen, usually boisterous, poled their wherries in near silence, watching the frantic activity on the banks, their eyes constantly scanning the estuary downriver, dreading the first sight of Spanish sails. The waiting which had tormented Richmond Palace now gripped the entire city, a suffocating blanket of fear before the storm. Sir Francis Walsingham, his face etched with sleeplessness, stood before a map cluttered with markers representing rumour as much as fact. Reports trickled in, often contradictory. Palmer was already at Canterbury. No, he was stalled near Sandwich by fierce militia fighting. A rider, mud-spattered and breathless, brought news that felt chillingly authentic. The Spanish vanguard, professional and brutal, had overwhelmed a hastily assembled defence outside Faversham. They weren't just marching, they were methodically crushing resistance, making examples. "Send word to Lord Hunsdon," Walsingham instructed a secretary, his voice raspy. "He must hold the Medway crossings at Rochester. Buy us time, whatever the cost." Time was a currency England was rapidly running out of. Meanwhile, near Ashford, a young Kentish farmer named Thomas clutched a newly issued pike, its shaft unfamiliar and heavy in his hands. Around him, under the command of a local squire whose bravery outstripped his military knowledge, stood 100 men like him, weavers, blacksmiths, ploughmen. They had heard the terrifying tales from the coast, seen the columns of smoke. Now they heard the rhythmic tramp of marching feet, the jingle of harness, the guttural commands in a foreign tongue. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Thomas's anger. He thought of his wife hiding with their children in the woods. He gripped the pike tighter, knuckles white. When the first Spanish arquebusiers emerged from the tree line, their polished morions gleaming dully, the squire bellowed a challenge. It was answered by a disciplined volley of fire that ripped through the English ranks. Thomas saw the man beside him fall, clutching his chest. Chaos erupted. The Spanish infantry advanced, pikes levelled, a wall of steel and veteran resolve. Thomas found himself stumbling backwards, the squire's shouts lost in the screams and the roar of gunfire. This wasn't fighting, it was butchery. In London, the Lord Mayor desperately tried to impose order, directing the construction of more substantial barricades near Aldgate and Newgate. But fear was a potent solvent, dissolving civic duty. Carts loaded with possessions clogged the western roads towards Oxford and beyond, their owners ignoring the pleas of the trained band's captains trying to keep the routes clear for military movement. At St. Paul's, priests led prayers for deliverance, their voices trembling almost as much as the congregations kneeling before them. William Cecil, Lord Burghley, Elizabeth's most trusted adviser, argued fiercely with the Queen in the increasingly claustrophobic confines of the Tower of London, where she had relocated under heavy guard. "Your Majesty, London cannot hold indefinitely against Palmer's veterans. We must withdraw the court, rally forces in the Midlands." Elizabeth slammed her hand on the heavy oak table. "Withdraw, while my people face Spanish steel in the streets, while Palmer dictates terms from Whitehall. Never, I am Henry's daughter, Burghley, I do not run." Her eyes flashed, but Cecil saw the deep lines of strain, the slight tremor in her hand. "Majesty," he pleaded, softening his tone, "this is not cowardice, it is strategy. Palmer wants you. Your capture would break England's spirit far faster than the fall of London. Alive and free, you remain the symbol of resistance. Walsingham believes we can delay them," Elizabeth countered, looking towards her spymaster who stood silently near the arrow-slit window, gazing out at the frantic city. Walsingham turned. "Delay, Majesty, not defeat them here. Hunsdon might hold the Medway for a day, perhaps two. The trained bands, they have courage, but lack discipline and experience. They will fight street by street, but Palmer knows siegecraft. He will grind them down." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your presence here is a beacon, yes, but it also makes London the single point of failure. If the tower falls while you are within," he left the implication hanging. The news reached the Duke of Parma as his engineers began assessing the fortifications of Canterbury. whose terrified mayor had offered the keys to the city after only a token resistance. An English relief force marching south had been intercepted and scattered near Maidstone. His cavalry now ranged freely across much of Kent, yet reports from the coast were less encouraging. Spanish supply ships attempting the crossing from Calais were being savagely attacked by agile English pinnaces darting out from hidden harbours. Vice Admiral Howard, though unable to break the Armada's crescent formation guarding the main transport route, was bleeding Medina Sidonia's fleet, ship by ship, raid by raid. Drake, it was rumoured, was gathering ships further west, preparing a heavier blow. Palmer knew his window was closing. He needed the Thames estuary cleared, needed regular supplies. He dispatched urgent messages back to Medina Sidonia: break the English fleet, secure the sea lanes, or the army, victorious on land, might starve. He also sent scouts probing towards the Medway, testing the river's defences. The Queen's presence in London, confirmed by captured messengers, both delighted and worried him. It concentrated English resistance, but also offered the chance for a swift, decisive end to the war. He ordered his commanders to prepare for a rapid advance on Rochester as soon as Canterbury was fully secured. London and its defiant Queen awaited. The air in the Tower's council chamber grew heavier with each passing hour, thick with the smoke from guttering tallow candles and the unspoken fears of men accustomed to command, not desperation. Burghley, his face etched with worry lines deeper than the Thames at low tide, paced restlessly. Majesty, a dispatch rider from Huntston, he reports Palmer's vanguard has reached Strood. They are probing the bridge defences at Rochester. Elizabeth sat bolt upright in her high-backed chair, her jewelled fingers clenched on the carved lions' heads of the armrests. The tremor Cecil had noted earlier was gone, replaced by a rigid stillness. Probing or attacking. Walsingham stepped forward, his expression unreadable as ever. The initial assault was repulsed, Majesty. Huntston's men fought well, but it was a reconnaissance in force designed to test the fortifications and the garrison's resolve. Palmer brings his full weight now. Engineers, siege guns landed near Whitstable. Huntston cannot hold Rochester Bridge indefinitely against such power. He estimates 2 days, perhaps 3, before the crossing is forced. And then. Elizabeth's voice was sharp, cutting through the room's tension. Then, Majesty, Walsingham replied evenly, Palmer has an open road to London, save for whatever defence we can muster at Dartford or Blackheath. The trained bands are digging in along the south bank, but they are butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers facing the finest army in Christendom, Burghley finished bleakly. Majesty, I implore you again, a tactical withdrawal, north towards Hertford, rally the Levis from the Midlands. Let Palmer bleed himself taking a ruined London while you gather strength, and leave my city to Spanish rapine, leave my people to Palmer's mercy. Elizabeth stood abruptly, her slight frame radiating an intensity that made both men flinch. What strength is gathered by a queen who abandons her capital? What loyalty is commanded by a sovereign in flight? No, my lords, my father built this tower. My mother met her end within these walls. If England falls, let the Spaniards find Elizabeth here at the heart of it, not hiding in some provincial shire. Her gaze swept the room, daring contradiction. For a moment, only the crackle of the fire and the distant shouts from the ramparts broke the silence. Walsingham exchanged a glance with Burghley. The Queen's resolve was absolute, bordering on suicidal, yet undeniably magnificent. It was the spirit that had rallied England, but it might also doom it. Miles away, amidst the newly conquered, sullen streets of Canterbury, Alexander Farnese, Duke of Parma, felt the gnawing impatience return. The messenger from Medina Sidonia had brought excuses, not victories. The Duke's great armada remained largely intact, a menacing presence off the Kentish coast, but Howard and his damnable sea dogs continued their stinging attacks. Small convoys attempting the Calais-Dover run were intercepted with infuriating regularity. Worse, reports confirmed Drake was indeed massing a significant force near Plymouth, a potential hammer blow against the Armada's vulnerable western flank. Still no secure passage for the heavy siege train. Palmer snapped at his quartermaster general, Don Francisco de Bobadilla. Not yet, Your Excellency, Bobadilla admitted nervously, avoiding Palmer's penetrating gaze. Medina Sidonia assures us he is clearing the narrows, but the English wasps, they are relentless. We move what we can on barges from Calais under heavy escort, but it is slow, perilous work. The guns Huntston faces at Rochester are field pieces, sufficient for the initial assault, but not for reducing the Tower of London quickly. Palmer slammed a gauntleted fist onto the campaign table, rattling the pewter map weights. Perilous, slow, Bobadilla, every delay strengthens Elizabeth's hand, every day allows more English militia to gather. We took a gamble landing before the sea lanes were fully secured, trusting in the Armada's might. Now that gamble lengthens the odds against us. If we cannot bring London to heel swiftly, before winter rains turn Kent into a quagmire and disease begins its work. He let the sentence hang, the implications clear. His veterans were formidable, but they were not infinite, nor were they immune to hunger and sickness. The initial flush of victory was fading, replaced by the grinding reality of campaigning in a hostile, surprisingly resilient land. He needed Rochester Bridge. He needed the Medway crossing secured not just to advance, but to open a secondary supply route up the river, bypassing the coastal hornet's nest to some degree. Send word to Don Sancho Davila. He is to press the assault on the bridge with utmost vigor. Use the Walloon pioneers to undermine the southern abutment if necessary. I want that crossing forced by tomorrow nightfall, whatever the cost. Back in London, the news from Rochester spread like wildfire, morphing with each retelling. Fear curdled the autumn air. Shutters were hammered onto shop fronts. Wealthier merchants frantically loaded barges, hopping to escape upriver before the Spaniards arrived. On street corners, preachers railed against popish tyranny, while in taverns near the barracks, men of the trained bands drank deeply, their bravado barely masking their terror. Young Thomas Pinner, apprenticed to a Cheapside goldsmith, and now clutching a newly issued unfamiliar caliver, stood guard duty on the Southwark embankment. He could hear the frantic work gangs reinforcing the earthworks further downriver, their shouts echoing in the dusk. He'd drilled for weeks on Mile End Green, marching and countermarching, learning the loading sequence, prime pan, charge barrel, ram wad, seat ball, until his shoulders ached. But facing practiced targets was one thing. Facing Spanish tercios, whose ruthless reputation preceded them, was quite another. He thought of his master's daughter Alice, her tear-streaked face when he'd left. He gripped the cold metal of his weapon tighter. He wasn't fighting for the Queen, not really, or even for England. He was fighting so the Spaniards wouldn't reach Cheapside. That evening, Elizabeth did something unexpected. Forsaking the relative safety of the Tower, she rode out, accompanied only by a small troop of horse guards and a visibly apprehensive burglee, through the teeming streets towards St. Paul's. She wore no armor, only a simple gown, but her presence acted like a tonic. Where crowds had been sullen or fearful, cheers erupted. People surged forward, reaching out to touch her horse, shouting encouragement. God save Queen Bess, no surrender. At the steps of the partially rebuilt cathedral, she paused, turning her horse to face the multitude. Her voice, clear and carrying in the sudden hush, rang out. My loyal people, the Spaniard stands upon our shore, boasting of his strength. He comes with rack and thumbscrew, with fire and sword, to impose his will upon this free land, to extinguish the light of our faith. He thinks us weak, cowed, ready to bend the knee. He believes London will fall like a rotten apple. A roar of defiance answered her. But London is not Canterbury. England is not Flanders. We have stout hearts, strong arms, and a righteous cause. Let Palmer come. He will find every street a fortress, every house a redoubt, defended by men and women who value liberty more than life. I am here with you. I shall live and die amongst you all. While one stone of London stands upon another, while one loyal English heart beats within these walls, we shall not yield. The crowd went wild, a wave of patriotic fervor washing away fear, replacing it with fierce determination. Burghley watched, amazed and appalled. She was magnificent, reckless, playing on their emotions like a master lutenist. But fine words wouldn't stop Spanish cannonballs. As they rode back towards the Tower under torchlight, Walsingham intercepted them near Ludgate, his face grim. Majesty, news from the coast. A Spanish squadron forced its way past Howard's blockade near Margate. They landed siege artillery and several hundred more troops at Reculver. The net was tightening. Elizabeth's hand tightened on the pommel of her saddle, the leather cool against her skin despite the warm night. The cheers still echoed faintly behind them, a ghost of the fervor she had ignited. But Walsingham's words were a pail of icy water. Reculver, siege guns, Maury troops slipping through Howard's battered fleet like eels. The Tower gates loomed ahead, a black mouth swallowing them whole. Inside the Queen's privy chamber, the mood was starkly different from the public defiance. Maps lay strewn across a heavy oak table, marked with the inexorable red crosses indicating Spanish positions. Palmer's main force was consolidating around Canterbury, but the Reculver landing threatened the Thames estuary, the city's vital artery. They mean to choke us, Walsingham stated flatly, his fingers tracing the Kentish coastline. Howard is doing all he can, but the Dons have the numbers and the wind. They're landing men and materiel almost at will between Deal and Margate now. Burghley, pale and weary, slumped into a chair. We must consider contingencies, Majesty. Perhaps relocating the court further north. York. Elizabeth rounded on him, her eyes flashing. Contingencies, while London prepares to bleed. What message does that send, my Lord Treasurer? That their Queen values her own skin above her capital? No, I made my promise on the steps of St. Paul. Here I stay. Her voice softened slightly, tinged with exhaustion. But you are right, the situation is grave. Francis, she turned back to Walsingham, your network. What can be done to disrupt their supply lines, slow the advance of those guns? Walsingham's lips thinned. Agents are already working, Majesty. Sabotage, spreading rumors amongst their mercenaries, but Palmer is no fool. His patrols are rigorous, and the guns, they are heavy siege pieces. They will move slowly, but they will move. We have perhaps a week, maybe two, before they are positioned to bombard the walls. Then we use that week, Elizabeth declared, straightening her spine. Strengthen the river defences. More chains, more fire rafts. Every cannon we possess must be brought to bear on the southern approaches. And God help us, train the militia. That training fell heavily on men like Captain Harrison, a veteran of the Low Countries, whose patience wore thin under the relentless London drizzle. Thomas Fowler, soaked and shivering, stood in a long rank of apprentices, shopkeepers, and labourers near Bishopsgate. They drilled with pike and caliver, the movements clumsy, the shots often wild. Thomas's hands were raw from the unfamiliar weight of the musket, its recoil jarring his shoulder. He fumbled loading the powder and ball, earning a sharp rebuke from Harrison. "Faster, boy, do you think the Spaniards will wait while you measure your powder like it's fine silk? Load, ram, prime, fire." The volley crashed out, mostly hitting the muddy embankment far beyond the targets. Fear was a constant, cold knot in Thomas's belly. The bravado of the Queen's speech felt distant now, replaced by the gnawing reality of aching muscles, damp clothes, and the ever-present rumour mill. Tales spread like wildfire. Spanish atrocities in captured villages, Palmer's offer of amnesty quickly dismissed as lies, the dwindling supplies of grain in the city granaries. He saw Alice only fleetingly now, her father keeping her close to home. Her last whispered words, "Be safe, Thomas," were both a comfort and a burden. How could he be safe when Spanish scouts were reportedly probing as close as Southwark? The first real test came 3 days later. A foggy dawn shrouded the southern banks of the Thames. Thomas was part of a detachment sent to reinforce the makeshift bulwarks near London Bridge. Suddenly, shouting erupted further downriver, followed by the crackle of arquebus fire. Spanish pinnaces, ghosting through the mist, were attempting a landing near the clink. Panic rippled through the inexperienced militia. Men jostled, unsure whether to advance or retreat. Captain Harrison roared orders, trying to form a firing line. "Steady, hold your positions, pikemen forward." Thomas found himself gripping his musket, his knuckles white. He could hear the harsh commands of the Spanish officers across the water, the splash of oars, the thud of boats grounding on the muddy bank. Figures emerged from the fog, armored men, moving with disciplined speed, pikes lowered. A wave of terror washed over him, threatening to buckle his knees. He thought of Cheapside, of Alice's face. He couldn't run. "First rank present," Harrison bellowed. Thomas raised the heavy caliver, resting the barrel on the damp earthwork. He could see the enemy clearly now, their Morian helmets gleaming dully, their faces grim. He fumbled with the matchcord, his fingers numb with cold and fear. "Fire!" The ragged volley ripped through the air. Thomas flinched as his own weapon kicked back violently, the acrid smell of gunpowder stinging his nostrils. He saw a Spaniard stumble and fall, clutching his leg. Others kept coming. Arrows from the bridge towers rained down, and the defenders' cannons added their deeper roar to the cacophony. The Spanish returned fire, bullets thudding into the earthworks, whining overhead. A man beside Thomas screamed, dropping his pike and clutching a shattered arm. Blood sprayed across Thomas's sleeve. He barely registered reloading, his movements becoming almost automatic, driven by pure adrenaline and Harrison's relentless commands. The Spanish attack faltered under the concentrated fire, their boats becoming entangled near the shore. After a furious exchange lasting perhaps 20 minutes, they withdrew back into the mist, leaving several bodies sprawled on the foreshore. Silence descended, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the frantic cries for surgeons. Thomas leaned heavily on the parapet, shaking uncontrollably. He hadn't run, he had fired his weapon. He had seen men fall on both sides. The reality of war, stripped of glory, was brutal, terrifying, and sickeningly immediate. He felt no triumph, only a hollow relief and the nauseating smell of blood and gunpowder. The siege had truly begun. The air hung thick and still, carrying the coppery tang of blood and the lingering sulphur sting of powder. Men moved stiffly, avoiding looking at the Spanish dead being hauled unceremoniously from the mud by grappling hooks, their armor glinting wetly in the weak dawn light filtering through the thinning mist. Surgeons worked frantically behind the lines, their saws grating against bone, their shouts mingling with the whimpers of the injured. Thomas helped carry a fellow militiaman, whose face was a mask of agony, towards the makeshift aid station set up in a nearby tavern cellar. The man's leg was a mangled ruin below the knee. Thomas averted his eyes, focusing on placing his feet carefully on the slippery cobbles. He felt numb, detached, the adrenaline having ebbed away, leaving only exhaustion and a profound sense of unease. He hadn't known the man's name. Did it matter? He was just another body caught in the grinding gears of this unwanted war. Back at the earthworks, Captain Harrison stood surveying the river, his face etched with weariness but also a grim resolution. "Tested us," he said, his voice low and rough, directed at Thomas and a few others nearby who weren't tending the wounded or reinforcing the barricade. "Probed for weakness. They found none here today." He spat onto the ground. "But don't fool yourselves. Palmer doesn't give up easily. They'll be back, and likely not just with pinnaces next time." He scanned their faces. "Rest while you can, clean your pieces, stay alert." Days bled into weeks under the grey, oppressive London sky. The initial shock gave way to a grinding routine of watchfulness and want. Spanish cannon, positioned further downriver and across in Southwark, began a sporadic but unnerving bombardment. The deep thud of their firing became a constant backdrop to city life, followed by the terrifying whistle and eventual crump of impact. Sometimes it was distant, hitting warehouses near the docks, other times, closer, sending masonry crashing into the streets and civilians scrambling for cover. Food became scarce. The city's granaries were finite, and Spanish control of the river and surrounding countryside choked off supplies. Rations were cut, then cut again. Thin-faced citizens queued for hours for meager handouts of stale bread and watery soup. Mutterings grew louder, whispers of surrender, resentment towards the Queen's councillors who had fled north, leaving the city to its fate, and fear of the disciplined Spaniards camped just beyond the walls. Thomas saw desperation etched on the faces he passed on his patrols through the narrow, increasingly squalid streets. He saw a baker dragged from his shop by a furious mob, accused of hoarding flour. He saw children with swollen bellies and vacant eyes. The smell of fear was now joined by the stench of uncollected refuse and increasingly of sickness. Dysentery began to stalk the crowded tenements and the militia camps. From the watchtowers, they observed the methodical tightening of the Spanish noose. Parma's engineers were masters of siegecraft. Trenches snaked closer, protected by gabions filled with earth. Observation posts were established, and more artillery batteries were carefully emplaced, their bronze barrels aimed menacingly at the city's crumbling medieval walls, particularly near Ludgate and Newgate. Barges, heavily guarded, plied the Thames downstream, offloading siege guns, powder kegs, and endless supplies for the Spanish army, a stark contrast to the starvation within the city. Rumours swirled like the river fog. The Duke of Parma himself was overseeing the siege. Scottish border raids were drawing English forces away from any potential relief effort. Catholic sympathizers within the walls were preparing to open the gates. Truth and rumour became indistinguishable, feeding the gnawing anxiety. One rain-slicked afternoon, while guarding a checkpoint near Cripplegate, Thomas witnessed Captain Harrison arguing fiercely with Master Finch, a portly alderman shivering despite his fur-lined cloak. "We cannot feed ghosts, alderman," Harrison snapped, his voice tight with anger. "My men need bread, not promises. They stand watch 20 hours a day, they face Spanish shot, and their bellies rumble loud enough to wake the dead. How long do you expect them to hold a pike when they can barely stand?" Finch wrung his hands. "The reserves are perilously low, Captain. We must husband what remains. Prioritize the civic officials." "Civic officials won't stop a Spanish tercio," Harrison roared, drawing stares from passers-by. "If the walls fall because the defenders starved, your fine robes won't save you from Parma's justice." He turned abruptly, stalking away, leaving the alderman sputtering indignantly. Thomas felt a surge of grim agreement with Harrison. What was the point of this suffering if they lacked the basic strength to fight? He hadn't heard any news from Cheapside in days. Was Alice safe? Was she hungry? The thought gnawed at him constantly, a dull ache beneath the fear and exhaustion. He resolved to try and get a message through somehow, perhaps trade a portion of his meager ration for a favor from someone heading that way. The relative quiet of the past week, broken only by intermittent cannon fire and the sounds of Spanish trench digging, felt increasingly ominous. Harrison drilled the militia relentlessly, trying to impose discipline on exhausted, underfed men armed with a motley collection of pikes, bills, and agging arquebuses. Supplies of powder and shot were also dwindling. That evening, as dusk settled, bathing the city in shades of purple and grey, a new sound began, a persistent, heavy pounding from the west near Ludgate. It wasn't the familiar spaced roar of cannon, but a more concentrated, rhythmic smashing. Lookouts shouted down that the Spanish had brought heavy rams forward under the cover of darkness and protective mantlets, aiming directly at the ancient gatehouse. Simultaneously, the bombardment intensified along the entire western wall, pinning the defenders, the night erupting in flashes of fire and the deafening thunder of artillery. The real assault had begun. Alarm bells pealed frantically across the city, their frantic clangor counterpoint to the Spanish guns, signaling not just an attack, but perhaps the beginning of the end. Thomas gripped his musket, his heart pounding against his ribs, the hollow relief he'd felt after the first skirmish replaced by a cold dread. Parma was done probing. He was coming for London. The air thickened instantly with stone dust and the acrid stink of gunpowder. Splinters, large as a man's arm, flew from Ludgate's ancient timbers under the relentless blows of the rams. Each impact resonated through the very ground Thomas stood upon, a sickening vibration that traveled up his legs and settled in his gut. Beside him, a man screamed as a piece of dislodged masonry crushed his foot. Thomas flinched but kept his eyes fixed on the shifting shadows below, searching for targets among the engineers working the ram under the heavy timber mantlet. He raised his musket, took aim at a flicker of movement near the protective shield, and fired. The recoil slammed against his already bruised shoulder. Whether he hit anything, he couldn't tell. The chaos swallowed his single shot without a trace. Arrows arced down from the walls, alongside pots of boiling pitch and heavy stones, but the Spanish mantlets were stoutly built, deflecting much of the desperate fusillade. Return fire from Spanish arquebusiers, positioned in the newly dug trenches and behind hastily erected barricades, was lethally accurate. Men slumped silently on the parapet or cried out as musket balls found flesh. The surgeons stationed behind the wall was quickly overwhelmed, the groans of the wounded adding another layer to the hellish symphony. Thomas reloaded frantically, his fingers clumsy with cold and fear. Pour powder, ram wad, seat ball, prime pan, the motions were automatic, drilled into him by Harrison, but tonight they felt sluggish, disconnected. He risked a glance along the wall. Harrison was further down, near the gatehouse tower, bellowing orders, his voice barely audible over the din. He gestured emphatically, directing archers and arquebusiers towards the ram crews, trying to concentrate fire where it mattered most. Thomas saw Alderman Finch nearby, face pale and drawn, clutching a ledger as if it were a shield. Harrison spared him a look of pure contempt before turning back to the fight. Suddenly, a massive crash echoed from the gate, louder than before, followed by a cheer from the Spanish lines. A section of the outer oak planking had given way, revealing the heavy iron-bound timbers beneath. The rams now had a more focused point of impact. "Maury, fire on those devils," Harrison roared, pointing. "Tip the cauldrons, now!" Scalding pitch cascaded down, eliciting shrieks from below, momentarily driving the engineers back from the ram. But disciplined Spanish infantry moved forward, laying down suppressing fire to cover their comrades' retreat and return. A runner scrambled up to Harrison, gasping for breath. "Captain, St. Paul's reports scaling ladders sighted near the western bastion. They request." Harrison cut him off. "They hold, we cannot spare a single man. Tell them to hold or die." The runner hesitated, then scrambled away. The pressure was mounting on multiple points. Palmer wasn't just hammering the gate, he was testing the entire perimeter, stretching the exhausted defenders thin. Thomas fired again, aiming low at the legs visible beneath the mantlet. A cry went up, quickly silenced. He felt a grim satisfaction, quickly replaced by the urgent need to reload. His powder flask felt worryingly light. He glanced at the man next to him, a burly blacksmith named Watt who wielded a heavy billhook. Watt met his gaze, his face streaked with soot and sweat. "They mean to have it this night," Watt growled, hefting his weapon. Thomas nodded grimly. There was no doubt. The rhythmic pounding resumed, each blow against the weakened gate now sending shudders through the stonework. Dust rained down constantly. Another Spanish cannonball screamed overhead, striking the parapet further along with terrifying force, sending stone fragments flying. Thomas ducked instinctively. When he looked up, several men lay dead or injured, their cries lost in the general uproar. The gap in the defensive line was alarming. Panic flickered at the edge of Thomas's mind. They couldn't hold. There were too many Spaniards, too much artillery, too little hope. He thought of Alice, picturing her face, her smile. Was she huddled somewhere listening to this thunder, terrified? The thought spurred him, hardening his resolve. He couldn't let them reach her. He gripped his musket tighter, scanning the darkness below. He had to fight. For Alice, for London, for the memory of an England that seemed to be dying before his eyes. Down below, obscured by smoke and darkness, figures moved with disciplined purpose. Under the direction of seasoned engineers, protected by shields and covering fire, the Spanish pioneers worked relentlessly. They knew the importance of the gate. Taking Ludgate would crack London open. Palmer himself, watching from a vantage point beyond cannon range, received clipped reports from his aides. Progress was steady, casualties acceptable for the prize. He showed no emotion, his gaze fixed on the flickering lights and smoke-shrouded walls of the defiant city. He had patience, resources, and the iron will of his king behind him. London would fall. On the wall, Harrison rallied a group of men with pikes to plug the gap left by the cannon's strike. "Stand fast, show them London's steel," he yelled, drawing his own sword. His presence, his refusal to yield, seemed to inject a measure of courage back into the wavering defenders. Thomas saw it, felt it. They might be starving, exhausted, outnumbered, but they weren't beaten yet. He finished reloading, brought the musket to his shoulder, and peered back into the night, searching for another target. The pounding continued, a relentless heartbeat counting down the final hours of the besieged city. Another crash from the gate, louder still. A collective groan went up from the defenders. The inner timbers were starting to splinter. A horrendous splintering crack echoed along the wall, followed by the groaning screech of tortured metal hinges giving way. A section of the massive wooden gate buckled inwards, then burst apart under a final, coordinated heave from the Spanish battering ram. For a heartbeat there was silence, broken only by the crackling of nearby fires and the distant screams. Then a roar went up from the Spanish lines, a sound of primal triumph. Through the shattered opening, illuminated by flickering torches and the burning buildings beyond, poured the first wave of Spanish infantry, tercio veterans, pikes lowered, swords drawn, their morions gleaming dully. "They're through," someone shrieked near Thomas. Panic, cold and absolute, seized the defenders. Men scrambled back from the breach, some tripping over debris or the bodies of their comrades. Harrison roared orders, trying to form a secondary line at the top of the steps leading down from the walls, but it was chaos. Crossbow bolts and musket balls whizzed through the air from both sides. Thomas fired his musket point blank into the surge of attackers scrambling up the inner ramp, saw a man clutch his chest and fall back, then drew his hanger, a short, curved sword. There was no time to reload. He found himself shoulder to shoulder with Watt, whose face was a mask of fury. For London. Watt bellowed, swinging his makeshift axe into the face of a Spanish pikeman trying to gain the walkway. The Spaniard crumpled. Maury surged forward. It was butchery. The narrow confines of the gatehouse became a meat grinder. Steel rang on steel, men screamed and cursed in English, Spanish, Italian, German. Parma's army was a polyglot force united by discipline and the promise of plunder. Thomas fought mechanically, parrying a sword thrust, lunging forward, feeling his blade bite into flesh. He saw Harrison go down, overwhelmed by 3 pikemen, his final defiant shout cut short. The sight broke something in the remaining defenders. The line wavered, then collapsed entirely. Men turned and fled, trying to escape into the maze of city streets behind them. "Run, Thomas, save yourself," Watt yelled, shoving him backwards before turning to meet another charge, his axe swinging wildly. Thomas hesitated, then stumbled back, joining the stream of fleeing militia and citizens. The Spaniards poured through Ludgate, fanning out, securing the walls, their disciplined shouts replacing the panicked cries of the Londoners. He ran, stumbling through darkened, narrow lanes slick with refuse and spilled blood. Fires raged unchecked, casting monstrous shadows that danced and writhed. The sounds of fighting were everywhere, pockets of desperate resistance being systematically crushed. He had to find Alice. The thought hammered in his brain, overriding the fear. He remembered the address of the baker's family she was staying with near St. Paul's. He pushed through crowds of terrified civilins Chinese letter ing in terror, their faces pale masks in the firelight. Looting had begun. He saw figures, some Spanish soldiers, others opportunistic Londoners, smashing doors, dragging out goods, their shouts adding to the cacophony. He rounded a corner and collided with a Spanish patrol. 3 soldiers, faces grim under their helmets. Before he could react, one slammed the butt of his arquebus into Thomas's side. Pain exploded in his ribs, stealing his breath. He staggered back, raising his hanger defensively. They advanced, weapons ready. He knew he couldn't take them. He saw movement in a narrow alleyway to his left, a flash of white. Instinct took over. He feinted an attack, then dodged sideways into the alley, scrambling over overturned crates. Musket balls splintered wood near his head. He didn't look back, just ran deeper into the warren of passages, his breath rasping, the pain in his side a stabbing agony. He eventually reached the area near St. Paul's. The great cathedral loomed, untouched by the major fires so far, but its precincts were filled with smoke and confusion. He found the baker's street. The shop front was dark, the door splintered but holding. He banged on it, calling Alice's name, his voice hoarse. After an agonizing moment, a small Judas window opened. A terrified man's face peered out. "Who is it? Go away." "Thomas, I'm looking for Alice," he gasped. Recognition dawned. The door creaked open slightly. "Get inside, quickly." He slipped in. The baker bolted the door, adding extra bars. Alice was there, huddled with the baker's wife and children in the back room, their faces streaked with tears. She saw him and rushed forward, throwing her arms around him, sobbing. "Thomas, I thought. He held her tight, burying his face in her hair, the terror of the past hours momentarily forgotten in the relief of finding her safe. The baker watched them grimly. "They've taken Ludgate, the city. It's lost." Dawn broke grey and sullen over conquered London. Smoke hung heavy in the air, mingling with the smell of death and damp ashes. The sounds of fighting had mostly died down, replaced by the tramp of marching feet, the shouts of Spanish officers imposing order and the weeping of the bereaved. Alexander Farnese, Duke of Parma, rode through the subdued streets, escorted by his household guard. He surveyed the destruction with a detached gaze, noting the disposition of his troops, the securing of key points, the Tower, Whitehall, the bridges. His expression was unreadable, but inside a cold satisfaction settled. England, the stubborn heretic isle, was broken. Philip II's great enterprise had succeeded where storms and English seamanship had failed before. The bells of St. Paul's began to toll, but not in alarm or celebration. Priests in unfamiliar vestments, accompanying Parma's army, were already preparing the cathedral for its reconsecration, for the restoration of the mass troops rounded up known Protestants, militia members, anyone deemed a threat. Executions began quietly in hidden courtyards, away from the main streets, efficient and brutal. There would be no English defiance left to fester. Elizabeth, captured after a failed attempt to flee north, was held prisoner in the Tower, her fate to be decided by King Philip. Thomas, his ribs tightly bound, watched from a hidden window as a column of Spanish soldiers marched past, their pikes gleaming. Alice sat beside him, her hand gripping his tightly. The immediate danger had passed, but a new pervasive fear settled over them, colder and deeper than the terror of the siege. This was not just defeat, it was occupation. The city, their country, their way of life, all irrevocably changed. The whispers had already started. Forced conversions, the Inquisition arriving, lands confiscated and given to Spanish nobles or loyal English Catholics. The fall of London echoed across Europe. In Madrid, Te Deums were sung. In Amsterdam, despair gripped the Dutch rebels, now deprived of their main ally. In Paris, the Catholic League rejoiced, while Henry III felt the Spanish noose tighten. The balance of power had shifted seismically. The Spanish century, which had seemed to be waning, now entered its most dominant phase, built upon the ashes of English independence. Thomas looked at Alice, at the fear in her eyes that mirrored his own. Survival was the only victory left to them now. They were strangers in their own city, subjects of a foreign king and a hostile faith. He pulled her closer, the silence in the small room heavy with unspoken dread. Outside, the measured tread of patrols continued, a constant reminder of their subjugation. England, as they knew it, had vanished in the smoke and fire of a single, catastrophic summer. The Armada had landed, and the world had changed forever.